Welcome to a story that begins with death and ends with immortality. It is Christmas Day, 1642, and in a small farmhouse in the English countryside, a premature infant draws his first breath. He is so tiny that his mother later said he could fit inside a quart pot. The midwives give him no chance of survival. His father is already dead. His future seems non-existent. Yet this fragile child will grow up to unlock the secrets of the universe itself, to peer into the mind of God, and to fundamentally change how humanity understands reality. His name is Isaac Newton, and this is the complete story of the most brilliant mind in human history. Before we begin this extraordinary journey through one man's revolutionary discoveries, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything, and I'm genuinely curious where in the world you're watching from tonight. Drop a comment and let me know. Now, settle in as we travel back to the 17th century England to witness the birth of modern science itself. The England of 1642 was a nation tearing itself apart. King Charles I was at war with Parliament. Brother fought against brother in a civil war that would ultimately cost the king his head. Plague swept through the countryside with terrifying regularity. Superstition ruled the minds of common people. Witches were burned. Comets were seen as omens of doom. The very idea that the universe operated according to mathematical laws would have seemed like dangerous heresy to most. Into this chaotic world, Isaac Newton was born on January 4th, 1643, according to the new calendar, in the tiny village of Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire. His father, also named Isaac, had been an illiterate farmer who died 3 months before his son's birth. The family was not poor by the standards of rural England, but they were far from wealthy. They owned a modest stone farmhouse and some land, enough to survive but nothing more. Hannah Ayscough Newton, Isaac's mother, was left to raise her impossibly small infant alone. The boy was so premature that she could hold him in her cupped hands. Local women whispered that he would not live to see his first birthday, but Isaac Newton would prove them spectacularly wrong. The child who would one day explain the motion of planets was himself barely moving in those first months. He was weak, sickly, and showed no early signs of the genius that lay dormant within him. For 3 years, mother and son lived together in the farmhouse, a bond forming that would profoundly shape Newton's character. But when Isaac was 3 years old, everything changed. Hannah remarried a wealthy rector named Barnabas Smith, a man 30 years her senior. The marriage came with a terrible condition. Smith would not have the boy in his house. Isaac was left behind with his maternal grandmother, while his mother moved away to start a new life. The abandonment was devastating. At the age when most children are learning to trust the world, Isaac learned that those he loved most could disappear without warning. He would carry this wound for the rest of his life, becoming a man who trusted no one completely, who worked alone, and who guarded his discoveries with obsessive secrecy. The little boy left with his grandmother developed a fierce independence and a burning anger that would fuel his intellectual pursuits for decades to come. His grandmother, Marjorie Ayscough, did her best to care for him, but she was an elderly woman trying to manage a farm while raising a difficult child. Isaac showed early signs of mechanical genius, building windmills, water clocks, and sundials with startling precision, but he also showed signs of the emotional damage from his abandonment. At age 7, he wrote in a notebook a list of his sins, and among them was this chilling entry, threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. The rage was already there, waiting to be channeled. When Isaac was 10 years old, his stepfather died, and his mother returned to Woolsthorpe with 3 new children from her second marriage. The reunion was awkward and painful. Isaac had spent 7 formative years learning to live without her. Now she was back, but she was no longer entirely his. He had half-siblings who had enjoyed the mother's love that he had been denied. The family dynamics were complex and troubled. setting patterns of isolation and mistrust that would define Newton's adult relationships. Hannah Newton was a practical woman who expected her eldest son to follow in his father's footsteps as a farmer. She pulled him out of the local grammar school at age 12 and brought him home to learn the business of managing land and livestock. It was a disaster. Isaac had no interest in farming and even less aptitude for it. He was caught reading books when he should have been watching sheep. He built elaborate contraptions instead of mending fences. His mother's brother, William Ayscough, a graduate of Cambridge University, recognised that this boy was wasting away in the countryside. He convinced Hannah to send Isaac back to school. At 14, Isaac returned to the King's School in Grantham, where he had briefly studied before. This time, he threw himself into learning with an intensity that amazed his teachers. He mastered Latin and Greek with ease. He read voraciously, everything from classical texts to contemporary works on mathematics and natural philosophy. But it was his mechanical abilities that truly set him apart. He built working models of machines, created intricate drawings with mathematical precision, and began to show the first signs of the revolutionary thinking that would change the world. The headmaster of the King's School, Henry Stokes, recognised Isaac's extraordinary potential. When the time came for university, Stokes personally intervened to ensure that this brilliant but difficult young man would have his chance. In 1661, at the age of 18, Isaac Newton arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, carrying little more than a few books and an enormous ambition to understand how the world truly worked. Cambridge in 1661 was an ancient institution steeped in medieval traditions. Students still debated in Latin. The curriculum was dominated by Aristotelian philosophy that had changed little since the Middle Ages. The idea that knowledge should be gained through experiment rather than ancient authority was still revolutionary. Most professors taught exactly what had been taught for centuries, content to preserve rather than discover. Into this conservative environment walked a young man who would question everything. Newton entered as a subsizar, the lowest category of student, essentially a servant to wealthier classmates in exchange for his education. He cleaned their rooms, served their meals, and endured their condescension. The experience reinforced his sense of social isolation and his determination to prove his superiority through intellectual achievement. While other students spent their evenings drinking and socializing, Newton buried himself in books. He read not just the assigned texts, but works that pushed the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind awakening to its own power. He began to question Aristotelian physics, asking why objects fall and what keeps the planets in their orbits. He read the works of René Descartes, whose mechanical philosophy suggested that the universe operated like a vast machine according to mathematical laws. He studied the writings of Galileo Galilei, who had dared to point a telescope at the heavens and discovered that the Earth was not the centre of creation. These ideas were dangerous in a university that still officially supported the geocentric worldview, but Newton absorbed them eagerly. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The angry, isolated farm boy was becoming a natural philosopher of unprecedented ability. He began to see patterns where others saw chaos, to find mathematical relationships hidden in the complexity of natural phenomena. His mind works differently from other people's, with a capacity for sustained concentration that bordered on the supernatural. He could work on a single problem for days without eating or sleeping, driven by an insatiable need to understand. In his second year at Cambridge, Newton encountered the work of a contemporary mathematician that would change his life forever. The writings of John Wallis introduced him to the new analytical techniques that were revolutionizing mathematics across Europe. For the first time, Newton glimpsed the possibility that all of nature might be described in the language of mathematics. The idea was intoxicating and terrifying in its implications. If the universe was truly mathematical, then the mind that could master mathematics might unlock secrets that had been hidden since the beginning of time. But it was in his third year that Newton's genius truly began to manifest. In 1664, he discovered the work of Pierre de Fermat and other continental mathematicians who were developing what would become calculus. Newton threw himself into these studies with characteristic intensity, working through mathematical problems that would have defeated seasoned professors. His notebooks filled with original discoveries, innovations that pushed mathematics into entirely new territories. He was teaching himself at a level that few universities could provide. The academic year of 1664 to 1665 should have been Newton's final year at Cambridge, the culmination of his undergraduate studies. Instead, it became the beginning of something unprecedented in the history of human thought. As he prepared for his bachelor's degree, Newton was already operating at the level of the greatest mathematicians in Europe. His mind was primed for discovery, his mathematical tools were sharp, and his ambition was limitless. All he needed was the opportunity to put his abilities to the test. That opportunity would come in the most unlikely form imaginable. In the summer of 1665, as Newton completed his undergraduate degree, reports began to reach Cambridge of a terrible plague spreading through London. The Black Death had returned to England with a vengeance, killing thousands and forcing the authorities to take drastic action. Universities were closed, students were sent home. The intellectual life of the nation ground to a halt as people fled the cities for the supposed safety of the countryside. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe, to the same farmhouse where he had been born, carrying with him a collection of books and mathematical instruments. He expected to wait out the plague for a few months before returning to Cambridge to pursue his master's degree. Instead, he would spend nearly 2 years in rural isolation, cut off from the academic world, but free to think without interruption. Those 2 years, from 1665 to 1667, would become known as his annus mirabilis, his miracle years, during which he would make discoveries that would reshape human understanding of mathematics, physics, and astronomy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the magnitude of what Newton would accomplish during his forced exile from Cambridge, we must first understand the state of natural philosophy in the 1660s and the problems that had puzzled the greatest minds of the age for centuries. The universe in Newton's time was still largely mysterious, governed by forces that no one could explain and following laws that no one had discovered. The intellectual landscape that greeted Newton as he settled into his family farmhouse was a world in transition, caught between ancient certainties and revolutionary new ideas. For over 1,000 years, European scholars had accepted the teachings of Aristotle as gospel truth. The Greek philosopher had declared that heavy objects fall faster than light ones, that the earth sits motionless at the centre of the universe, while celestial spheres carry the planets in perfect circles, and that motion requires a constant force to maintain it. These ideas seem to align with common sense and religious doctrine, making them nearly unassailable. But cracks were beginning to show in this ancient edifice. Galileo had dropped objects from the Leaning Tower of Pisa and discovered that they fell at the same rate regardless of their weight. He had pointed his telescope at Jupiter and found moons orbiting around it, proving that not everything in the heavens circled the Earth. Johannes Kepler had studied the motion of Mars with painstaking precision and concluded that planets moved in ellipses, not circles, and that they sped up and slowed down in their orbits according to mathematical laws that no one could explain. The Catholic Church had forced Galileo to recant his support for the Copernican system, but the damage was done. The Earth was no longer the centre of creation. The heavens were no longer perfect and unchanging. The universe was far stranger and more complex than anyone had imagined. Yet even the boldest natural philosophers of the 1660s could only describe what they observed. They could not explain why the planets moved as they did, or what invisible force kept them in their orbits, or how the same laws that governed falling apples might also govern the motion of the moon. Newton arrived at Woolsthorpe, carrying these unsolved mysteries in his mind, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow. The plague had inadvertently created the perfect environment for genius to flourish. There were no lectures to attend, no professors to please, no social obligations to fulfill. There was only silence, solitude, and the freedom to think without interruption. The young man who had learned to live alone as a child now had the opportunity to explore the deepest questions about reality itself. His mother's farmhouse became a laboratory of the mind. Newton set up a study in his childhood bedroom, covering the walls with mathematical diagrams and experimental apparatus. He had brought books on mathematics, optics, and mechanics from Cambridge, but he quickly moved beyond what any textbook could teach him. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind working at the very limits of human capability, making leaps of insight that would have taken lesser intellects decades to achieve. The first breakthrough came in mathematics. Newton had been studying the problem of finding the area under curved lines, a challenge that had occupied mathematicians since ancient times. The traditional approach involved approximating curves with straight lines and rectangles, a laborious process that became more accurate as the rectangles became smaller but never quite exact. Newton realized that this process could be taken to its logical extreme, using infinitely small quantities that he called fluxions to calculate exact areas under any curve. Working alone in his room, often forgetting to eat or sleep, Newton developed what would later be known as the calculus. This was not merely a new mathematical technique, but an entirely new way of understanding change and motion. With his method of fluxions, Newton could analyze how quantities changed over time, find maximum and minimum values of complex functions, and solve problems that had been considered impossible. He was creating the mathematical language that would be needed to describe the physical laws he was about to discover. But Newton kept his mathematical discoveries largely to himself. This was partly due to his natural secretiveness, a trait that would frustrate other mathematicians for decades to come. It was also a reflection of his perfectionist nature. Newton was never satisfied with partial solutions or incomplete proofs. He would rather work in isolation for years than share an idea before he was certain it was correct. This tendency would later lead to bitter priority disputes, but during the plague years it allowed him to develop his ideas without outside interference. The second great discovery of Newton's miracle years came through his experiments with light. He had purchased a prism at a fair in Cambridge, intending to use it to study the optical theories of René Descartes. But when he held the prism up to a beam of sunlight streaming through his window, what he saw challenged everything that natural philosophers believed about the nature of light and colour. The accepted wisdom held that white light was pure and simple, the most basic form of illumination. Colours were thought to be modifications of white light, created when it was weakened or contaminated by passing through different materials. A prism produced colours because it somehow altered the pure white light, not because it revealed anything that was already there. This explanation seemed reasonable and had the authority of centuries behind it. Newton's careful observations told a different story. When he passed white light through his prism, it spread out into a beautiful spectrum of colours, from red through orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. More remarkably, when he used a second prism to recombine these colours, they merged back into pure white light. This suggested that white light was not simple at all, but rather a mixture of all the colours of the spectrum. The prism was not creating colours, but separating them. Like a key unlocking secrets that had been hidden in plain sight, he tested this hypothesis with characteristic thoroughness. He isolated individual colours from the spectrum and passed them through additional prisms. Red light remained red, blue light remained blue. No amount of refraction could change one pure colour into another. This proved that colours were fundamental properties of light itself, not modifications imposed by external materials. Newton had discovered that what appears simple to the human eye is actually profoundly complex, composed of elements that can be separated and analysed mathematically. These optical experiments led Newton to a deeper understanding of how the human eye perceives colour and how telescopes could be improved. He realised that the chromatic aberration that plagued refracting telescopes was an inevitable consequence of the way light behaves, not a flaw that could be corrected with better lenses. This insight would later inspire him to design reflecting telescopes that used mirrors instead of lenses, revolutionizing astronomy and making possible the detailed observations of distant stars and galaxies. But it was Newton's third great discovery during the plague years that would have the most profound impact on human understanding of the cosmos. As he sat in the garden at Woolsthorpe, watching an apple fall from a tree, he began to wonder about the nature of gravity itself. Why did the apple fall down rather than up or sideways? What force compelled it to accelerate toward the Earth? And could this same force be responsible for keeping the Moon in its orbit around the Earth? The idea was audacious. Terrestrial physics and celestial mechanics had been considered completely separate domains since ancient times. Objects on Earth fell because they sought their natural place at the centre of the universe. The planets moved because they were carried by crystalline spheres or pushed by angels. To suggest that the same force governed both an apple and the Moon seemed to blur the fundamental distinction between the corrupt, changing world below and the perfect, eternal heavens above. Yet Newton's mathematical mind saw patterns where others saw only separate phenomena. He calculated that if gravity decreased with the square of the distance from Earth's centre, the force that made an apple fall could indeed provide the centripetal acceleration needed to keep the Moon in orbit. The mathematics worked perfectly, but the implications were staggering. If Newton was correct, then the entire universe operated according to a single set of mathematical laws that applied equally to earthly and celestial phenomena. This insight required Newton to reconceptualize motion itself. Aristotelian physics held that objects in motion naturally came to rest unless constantly pushed. But Newton realized that motion was the natural state of objects, and that they would continue moving in straight lines forever unless acted upon by an external force. This principle, which would become his first law of motion, meant that the planets did not need to be pushed along their orbits. They needed only to be pulled constantly toward the Sun to curve their natural straight-line motion into elliptical paths. The young man working alone in a Lincolnshire farmhouse had glimpsed something unprecedented in human history. He had seen the mathematical unity underlying all physical phenomena. The same equations that described falling apples also governed the motion of planets, comets, and tides. The universe was not a collection of separate realms operating by different rules, but a single, magnificent system following laws that could be discovered and expressed in mathematical form. These revelations came to Newton not as sudden flashes of inspiration, but as the result of intense, sustained thought. He would work on a single problem for days or weeks, filling notebook after notebook with calculations, diagrams, and geometric proofs. His concentration was so complete that his mother often found his meals untouched, the food cold and forgotten, while he pursued some mathematical insights. He was driven by an almost mystical conviction that the secrets of creation could be unlocked through pure reason and careful observation. By the end of 1666, Newton had laid the groundwork for discoveries that would transform mathematics, physics, and astronomy. He had invented calculus, explained the nature of light and colour, and formulated the basic principles of what would become his theory of universal gravitation. He was 24 years old, working in complete isolation, and he had already accomplished more than most scientists achieve in entire careers. Yet he told no one about his discoveries. The shy, secretive young man preferred to work alone, testing and refining his ideas until they met his impossibly high standards. The plague that had driven Newton from Cambridge was beginning to subside by early 1667. Reports from London indicated that the death toll was dropping and that normal life was gradually resuming. Universities were preparing to reopen their doors to students and faculty who had been scattered across the English countryside. Newton faced a choice that would determine the course of his future. He could remain at Woolsthorpe, continuing his private investigations into the nature of reality, or he could return to Cambridge and begin the challenging process of sharing his discoveries with the world. His discoveries with the world. The decision to return to Cambridge was not made lightly. Newton had tasted the pure freedom of intellectual discovery, the intoxicating experience of pushing into uncharted territories of knowledge without the constraints of academic bureaucracy or the need to justify his work to skeptical professors. At Woolsthorpe, he had been free to follow his thoughts wherever they led, to spend weeks on a single calculation, to abandon conventional wisdom whenever his experiments contradicted it. The prospect of returning to the rigid structure of university life, with its formal lectures and prescribed curriculum, must have seemed like a kind of intellectual imprisonment. Yet Newton understood that isolation, however productive, could only take him so far. The discoveries he had made during his miracle years needed to be tested against the scrutiny of other minds, refined through debate and criticism, and ultimately shared with the world. Science, even for a genius of Newton's calibre, was ultimately a collaborative endeavour. The greatest insights meant nothing if they remained locked away in private notebooks, accessible only to their creator. Cambridge, for all its limitations, offered something that Woolsthorpe could not: a community of scholars who could challenge, extend, and ultimately validate his revolutionary ideas. In the spring of 1667, Newton packed his books and mathematical instruments and made the journey back to Trinity College. The Cambridge he found was subtly different from the one he had left. The plague had shaken everyone's confidence in the old certainties. Death had stalked the corridors of learning, reminding scholars that their ancient texts offered no protection against the unpredictable forces of nature. There was a new openness to experimental philosophy, a willingness to question traditional authorities that had been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The intellectual climate was ripe for the kind of revolutionary thinking that Newton had been developing in secret. Newton resumed his studies as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. He was no longer the uncertain undergraduate who had left Cambridge 2 years earlier. He was now in possession of mathematical and physical insights that surpassed anything being taught at the university, yet he revealed nothing of what he had discovered. He attended lectures, completed assignments, and prepared for his master's degree with characteristic diligence, all while harbouring knowledge that would eventually transform human understanding of the natural world. His professors noticed that something was different about the young man who had returned from the plague years. Newton's questions in lectures were more probing, his mathematical abilities more sophisticated, his grasp of physical principles more intuitive. When he solved problems that stumped other students, he did so with an ease that suggested he was working from a deeper understanding than anything the curriculum provided. Yet when pressed about his methods, Newton would offer only cryptic explanations, reluctant to reveal the full extent of his discoveries. The transformation was most evident in his mathematical work. Newton's undergraduate notebooks had shown promise, but his post-plague calculations displayed a mastery that bordered on the supernatural. He could solve in minutes problems that had occupied professional mathematicians for months. His geometric proofs possessed an elegance and power that left his tutors struggling to follow his reasoning. It was clear that during his time away from Cambridge, Newton had somehow leaped far ahead of his contemporaries in mathematical sophistication. Isaac Barrow, the Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge, was among the first to recognise the extraordinary talent that had emerged from the plague years. Barrow was himself a gifted mathematician and a perceptive judge of intellectual ability. When he examined Newton's work, he realised he was looking at something unprecedented in his experience as an educator. The young man's mathematical insights were not merely advanced, they were revolutionary, pointing toward entirely new ways of understanding mathematical relationships and physical phenomena. Barrow became Newton's mentor and advocate, gradually drawing him into the intellectual life of the university. Under Barrow's guidance, Newton began to emerge from his shell of secrecy, though he remained characteristically cautious about revealing his most important discoveries. He started to participate in mathematical discussions with other scholars, sharing carefully selected insights while keeping his most revolutionary ideas to himself. It was a delicate balancing act, designed to establish his reputation without exposing the full scope of his achievements to potential critics or rivals. The academic year of 1667 to 1668 marked Newton's gradual transition from student to scholar. He received his Master of Arts degree in 1668, an achievement that would normally have marked the pinnacle of his formal education. But Newton's real education had taken place not in Cambridge classrooms, but in the solitude of his mother's farmhouse, where he had taught himself to see the universe in ways that no professor could have shown him. The degree was merely a credential, a piece of paper that allowed him to pursue his real calling as a natural philosopher. As Newton established himself at Cambridge, he began to grapple with a problem that would plague him throughout his career: how to share his discoveries without exposing himself to the bitter priority disputes that characterized 17th century science. The academic world was a ruthless environment where careers could be made or destroyed by claims of intellectual theft. Newton had seen how Galileo's revolutionary ideas had earned him the enmity of the Catholic Church, and how other natural philosophers had been attacked by rivals who questioned their methods or their conclusions. Newton's solution was characteristic of his personality. He would share his ideas gradually, testing the waters before revealing his most important insights. He began by circulating mathematical papers that demonstrated his mastery of advanced techniques without fully explaining the methods he had developed. These papers created a sensation among Cambridge mathematicians who recognized that they were seeing work of unprecedented sophistication but could not quite understand how it had been achieved. The strategy worked perfectly. Newton's reputation as a mathematical genius spread throughout the university and beyond, but the full extent of his discoveries remained hidden. He was like a master magician performing amazing feats while keeping his most important secrets locked away. This approach allowed him to build credibility and influence while protecting himself from the criticism and controversy that might have greeted a more open revelation of his revolutionary ideas. In 1669, an opportunity arose that would change the trajectory of Newton's career forever. Isaac Barrow announced his intention to resign the Lucasian professorship of mathematics to pursue his interests in theology. The Lucasian chair was one of the most prestigious academic positions in England, established just a few years earlier to promote mathematical learning at Cambridge. Barrow's recommendation would carry enormous weight in choosing his successor, and he had become convinced that only one person possessed the mathematical brilliance necessary to fill the position with distinction. The choice was unprecedented. Newton was only 26 years old, with no published works to his name, and minimal teaching experience. By conventional standards, he He was completely unqualified for such a prestigious position. But Barrow understood what others could not see, that Newton's mathematical abilities transcended normal academic credentials. He had witnessed firsthand the extraordinary power of Newton's mind, and he was convinced that Cambridge would benefit immeasurably from having such a genius on its faculty. The appointment faced significant opposition from traditionalists who questioned whether such a young and inexperienced scholar could handle the responsibilities of a professorship. Some suspected that Barrow's recommendation was based more on personal favouritism than objective assessment of Newton's qualifications. The controversy might have derailed a less talented candidate, but Newton's mathematical demonstrations gradually silenced his critics. When he solved problems that had stumped senior faculty members, when he explained complex geometrical relationships with startling clarity, when he displayed an intuitive grasp of mathematical principles that seemed almost supernatural, even his harshest critics had to acknowledge his exceptional abilities. On October 29, 1669, Isaac Newton was appointed Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge University. At 26, he had achieved a position that most academics could only dream of reaching at the end of long and distinguished careers. The appointment carried with it not just prestige, but also the freedom to pursue his research without the financial pressures that constrained most scholars. Newton now had the security and independence he needed to transform his private discoveries into public knowledge. The new professor's first challenge was to decide what to teach. The traditional mathematics curriculum at Cambridge was centuries out of date, focused on classical geometry and arithmetic, with little attention to the revolutionary developments that were transforming mathematics across Europe. Newton could have played it safe, delivering standard lectures on familiar topics while pursuing his real interests in private. Instead, he chose to use his position as a platform for introducing his students to the cutting edge of mathematical thinking. Newton's early lectures were unlike anything Cambridge had ever seen. He presented his audience with problems that pushed the boundaries of contemporary mathematics, demonstrated techniques that seemed almost magical in their power and elegance, and opened windows onto mathematical landscapes that most students had never imagined existed. His method of fluxions, still kept secret from the wider world, allowed him to solve problems that would have been impossible using traditional methods. Students watched in amazement as their young professor performed mathematical feats that seemed to defy explanation. But Newton's teaching style reflected his personality, brilliant but often impenetrable. He had little patience for students who could not follow his rapid-fire explanations or grasp the subtleties of his mathematical reasoning. His lectures were delivered to increasingly empty halls as students found themselves overwhelmed by material that was far beyond their preparation. Newton seemed oblivious to their struggles, lost in the beauty of mathematical relationships that he could see clearly but could not easily communicate to others. The isolation that had served Newton well during his research years became a liability in his role as an educator. He had spent so much time working alone that he had lost the ability to see his ideas from other people's perspectives. What seemed obvious to his extraordinary mind was incomprehensible to ordinary intellects. His students respected his genius, but found his teaching methods frustrating and often impossible to follow. Newton's lectures became famous throughout Cambridge, but more for their difficulty than for their effectiveness as education. Despite his struggles as a teacher, Newton's appointment to the Lucasian chair marked the beginning of his emergence as a major figure in the scientific revolution. The position gave him credibility and visibility that his private research could never have achieved. Other scholars began to seek him out, curious about the mathematical techniques that had enabled his remarkable demonstrations. Correspondence started to flow between Cambridge and other centres of learning, as Newton gradually began to share selected insights with the broader community of natural philosophers. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The secretive young man who had hidden his discoveries in private notebooks was slowly becoming a public intellectual, forced by his position to engage with the wider world of learning. The process was often uncomfortable for Newton, who preferred the solitude of his study to the collaborative exchanges that characterized academic life. But it was also necessary if his ideas were to have the impact they deserved. Newton's first major public revelation came through his work on optics, the study of light that had occupied him during the plague years. His experiments with prisms had led him to revolutionary conclusions about the nature of colour and light, but he had shared these insights with no one. Now, as a Cambridge professor with access to better equipment and more sophisticated instruments, he began to extend and refine his optical research. The results would soon shake the foundations of natural philosophy and announce to the world that a new kind of scientific genius had emerged. The stage was set for Newton to transform from a private researcher into a public revolutionary. His years of secret discovery were about to give way to decades of public controversy, acclaim, and bitter dispute. The quiet professor who delivered incomprehensible lectures to empty halls was preparing to unleash ideas that would challenge everything the scientific world thought it knew about light, motion, and gravity itself. The real drama of Newton's life was about to begin. In 1671, Newton made a decision that would catapult him from obscurity into the centre of European scientific debate. He had been working in secret on a revolutionary telescope design, one that used mirrors instead of lenses to gather and focus light. Traditional refracting telescopes suffered from chromatic aberration, a blurring effect caused by different colours of light bending at slightly different angles as they passed through glass. Newton's optical experiments had taught him that this problem was fundamental to the nature of light itself, not a flaw that could be corrected with better craftsmanship. His reflecting telescope was tiny compared to the massive instruments used by professional astronomers, measuring only 6 inches long with a mirror just over an inch in diameter. Yet it performed as well as refracting telescopes 6 feet in length. The design was elegant in its simplicity, using a curved mirror to gather light and a small flat mirror to direct the image to an eyepiece. The result was a sharp, clear image, free from the colour distortions that plagued conventional telescopes. Word of Newton's remarkable instrument spread quickly through Cambridge and beyond. The Royal Society of London, England's premier scientific organisation, requested a demonstration. When Newton's little telescope was presented to the assembled fellows, it created a sensation. Here was proof that the young Cambridge professor possessed not just theoretical knowledge, but practical genius as well. The telescope worked better than instruments costing many times more to build. The Royal Society was so impressed that they elected Newton as a Fellow in 1672, an extraordinary honour for a man who had published nothing and was known outside Cambridge only through rumours of his mathematical abilities. The election opened doors that had been closed to Newton throughout his career. He now had access to a network of natural philosophers across Europe, men who were grappling with the same fundamental questions about the nature of reality that had occupied his thoughts for years. But Newton's triumph came with an unexpected price. The Royal Society requested that he share the theoretical principles behind his telescope's superior performance. This meant revealing his controversial discoveries about light and colour, insights that contradicted centuries of accepted wisdom. Newton hesitated, knowing that his ideas would provoke fierce opposition from established authorities. Yet he also recognised that this was his opportunity to contribute something genuinely revolutionary to human knowledge. In February 1672, Newton sent a letter to the Royal Society outlining his theory of light and colours. The paper was a masterpiece of experimental science, describing in meticulous detail how white light could be separated into its component colours and then recombined. Newton explained that colours were not modifications of white light, but rather fundamental properties of light itself. Red light was essentially different from blue light, not simply white light that had been altered in some way. The response was immediate and violent. Robert Hooke, one of England's most respected natural philosophers and a curator of experiments for the Royal Society, launched a devastating attack on Newton's conclusions. Hooke argued that Newton's experiments could be explained using the traditional wave theory of light, without accepting the revolutionary claim that white light was composite rather than simple. The criticism was technically sophisticated and personally insulting, suggesting that Newton had misinterpreted his own observations. The controversy revealed Newton's greatest weakness as a scientist, his inability to tolerate criticism. Where other natural philosophers thrived on debate and saw opposition as an opportunity to refine their ideas, Newton perceived any challenge as a personal attack. His response to Hooke was defensive and angry, insisting that his experiments spoke for themselves and that critics who disagreed simply did not understand what they were seeing. The exchange escalated into a bitter feud that would poison relations between the two men for decades. Other critics emerged from across Europe. Christian Huygens, the brilliant Dutch mathematician and astronomer, questioned Newton's methodology and suggested alternative explanations for his optical phenomena. Ignace Pardis, a French Jesuit, raised theological objections to Newton's conclusions, arguing that they implied a mechanistic view of creation incompatible with divine providence. Each criticism stung Newton deeply, reinforcing his natural tendency towards secrecy and isolation. The optical controversy taught Newton a painful lesson about the price of scientific fame. Recognition brought with it scrutiny, and scrutiny brought criticism from men who were determined to defend their own theories and reputations. Newton began to understand why so many natural philosophers kept their most important discoveries secret, sharing them only with trusted colleagues who could be counted on for support rather than opposition. The collaborative ideal of science seemed increasingly naive to a man who had experienced the viciousness of academic politics firsthand. Despite the controversy, Newton's optical work established his reputation as one of Europe's leading experimental philosophers. His techniques were copied by instrument makers across the continent, and his reflecting telescope design became the standard for serious astronomical observation. The Royal Society continued to seek his advice on technical matters, and correspondence poured in from scientists who wanted to learn more about his methods. Newton had achieved the recognition he had always craved, but he was discovering that fame was a double-edged sword. The bitter disputes over optics convinced Newton to retreat once again into secrecy. He had shared one major discovery with the world and had been savagely attacked for his efforts. His other great insights, particularly his work on mathematics and mechanics, remained locked away in private notebooks, where they could not be subjected to criticism or appropriation by rivals. Newton began to develop the defensive mentality that would characterize his later career, trusting no one completely and revealing his ideas only when absolutely necessary. This period of withdrawal might have lasted indefinitely if not for an unexpected visit that would change the course of scientific history. In August 1684, a young astronomer named Edmund Halley arrived at Newton's rooms in Cambridge with a question that had been troubling the best minds in Europe. Halley wanted to know what curve a planet would trace if it were attracted to the Sun by a force that decreased with the square of the distance between them. The question was not merely theoretical. Johannes Kepler had established that planets moved in elliptical orbits, but no one had been able to explain why. Recent work by Hooke, Halley, and Christopher Wren had suggested that an inverse square law of attraction might be responsible, but none of them possessed the mathematical tools necessary to prove their hypothesis. They had reached the limits of what could be accomplished through intuition and geometric reasoning. What was needed was a new kind of mathematics, one powerful enough to handle the complexities of planetary motion. Newton's response to Halley's question was casual, almost offhand. An ellipse, he said, as if the answer were obvious. Halley was stunned. How could Newton be so certain? Had he proved this remarkable result? Newton replied that he had indeed proved it years earlier, but he could not immediately find the calculation among his papers. He promised to send a demonstration to Halley as soon as he could locate or reconstruct the proof. What Halley did not realize was that he had stumbled upon one of the greatest scientific secrets in history. Newton had not merely solved the problem of planetary motion, he had developed an entire system of mechanics that explained the behavior of all moving objects, from falling apples to orbiting comets. The mathematics he had created during the plague years, combined with his insights into the nature of force and motion, had given him the key to understanding the mechanical universe that Descartes and others had dreamed of but never achieved. The promised demonstration that Newton sent to Halley in November 1684 was a 9-page treatise titled De Motu Corporum in Gyrum, or On the Motion of Bodies in an Orbit. The paper was unlike anything that had ever been written about celestial mechanics. Using his method of fluxions and his 3 laws of motion, Newton showed that Kepler's laws of planetary motion followed inevitably from a single assumption, that every particle of matter in the universe attracted every other particle with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. The implications were staggering. Newton had discovered that the same force responsible for making objects fall on Earth also kept the planets in their orbits around the Sun and the Moon in its orbit around the Earth. Gravity was not a terrestrial phenomenon, but a universal force that operated throughout the cosmos according to precise mathematical laws. The distinction between earthly and celestial physics, which had been fundamental to natural philosophy since ancient times, had been obliterated at a stroke. Halley recognized immediately that he was looking at the most important scientific work of the age. He rushed back to Cambridge to urge Newton to expand his demonstration into a full treatment of mechanics and astronomy. Newton was reluctant, knowing from experience how controversial his ideas could become. But Halley's enthusiasm was infectious, and the younger man's promise to handle all the practical details of publication gradually overcame Newton's resistance. What followed was an extraordinary burst of creative activity that lasted for nearly 3 years. Newton threw himself into the task of writing his masterwork with the same obsessive intensity that had characterized his plague years' research. He worked 18 hours a day, often forgetting to eat or sleep, driven by a vision of mathematical perfection that demanded nothing less than a complete reconstruction of natural philosophy. His servants found him in the morning standing exactly where they had left him the night before, still working on the same calculation. The book that emerged from this period of manic creativity would be titled Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. The Principia, as it came to be known, was unlike any scientific work that had ever been written. It combined rigorous mathematical reasoning with comprehensive physical explanation in a way that had never been attempted before. Newton did not simply describe how the universe worked. He proved that it had to work the way it did, given certain fundamental assumptions about the nature of matter and force. The first book of the Principia established the mathematical foundations of mechanics, presenting Newton's 3 laws of motion and showing how they could be used to analyze the behavior of moving objects under various conditions. The mathematical techniques were revolutionary involving infinitesimal analysis and limit processes that would not be fully understood by other mathematicians for decades. Newton was writing in a mathematical language that he had largely invented himself, using tools that existed nowhere else in contemporary science. The second book dealt with motion in resisting media, analysing how objects moved through air, water, and other fluids. Newton demolished the Cartesian theory of vortices, which attempted to explain planetary motion by proposing that the planets were carried along by swirling currents in an invisible medium that filled all space. Through careful mathematical analysis, Newton showed that such vortices were impossible. They would either dissipate quickly or interfere with planetary motion in ways that contradicted observation. But it was the third book that contained Newton's most revolutionary insights. Here he applied his mathematical methods to the actual solar system, showing that his law of universal gravitation could account for every known astronomical phenomenon. The complex motions of the moon, which had puzzled astronomers for centuries, emerged as natural consequences of gravitational attraction from both Earth and Sun. The tides, which had been explained through various occult influences, were shown to result from the moon's gravitational pull on Earth's oceans. Even the slight deviations in planetary orbits could be explained as perturbations caused by gravitational interactions between the planets themselves. Perhaps most remarkably, Newton used his theory to make specific predictions that could be tested against future observations. He calculated that Earth should be slightly flattened at the poles due to its rotation, a prediction that would not be confirmed until decades later. He predicted the return of a comet that had been observed by Halley, calculating that it followed an elliptical orbit with a period of approximately 76 years. When the comet returned exactly as predicted in 1758, 16 years after Newton's death, it provided dramatic confirmation of the power of his gravitational theory. The Principia was completed in 1687, after 3 years of unparalleled intellectual effort. Newton had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of human thought. He had reduced the complexity of the physical universe to a small number of simple mathematical laws. Everything from the fall of a stone to the precession of the equinoxes could now be calculated with precision using the same fundamental principles. The ancient dream of natural philosophy had been realized. The book of nature was indeed written in the language of mathematics, but Newton's masterpiece faced enormous obstacles on its path to publication. The Royal Society, which had initially promised to publish the work, was facing financial difficulties after losing money on an expensive natural history book that had failed to sell. Halley, recognizing the historic importance of the Principia, took personal responsibility for its publication, paying all costs out of his own modest income and overseeing every detail of the printing process. Even more challenging was the intellectual resistance the book encountered from established authorities. The Principia required its readers to accept ideas that seemed to violate common sense and contradict religious doctrine. The notion that empty space could be filled with attractive forces operating across vast distances seemed to many critics like a return to the occult qualities that modern natural philosophy had supposedly banished. The Catholic Church, still smarting from its confrontation with Galileo, was suspicious of any theory that seemed to reduce divine providence to mechanical necessity. The mathematical difficulty of the Principia also limited its initial impact. Newton had written the book in the style of classical geometry, avoiding his method of fluxions partly to prevent priority disputes, and partly because he believed geometric demonstration carried more authority than algebraic manipulation. The result was a work of extraordinary rigour but forbidding complexity. Only a handful of mathematicians in Europe possessed the skills necessary to follow Newton's reasoning in detail. Despite these obstacles, the Principia gradually established itself as one of the supreme achievements of human intellect. Those who could understand it recognized that Newton had accomplished something unprecedented, creating a mathematical description of nature that was both comprehensive and precise. The book transformed natural philosophy from a collection of qualitative observations into an exact science capable of prediction and verification. The publication of the Principia marked the culmination of Newton's creative period and the beginning of his transformation into a scientific legend. At 44, he had achieved everything a natural philosopher could hope to accomplish. He had solved the fundamental problems of mechanics and astronomy, created new mathematical methods of extraordinary power, and demonstrated that the universe operated according to laws that human reason could discover and understand. The shy, secretive professor who had hidden his discoveries for decades had finally shared his greatest insights with the world. But success brought new challenges that would test Newton's character in ways that pure research never had. Fame attracted admirers but also enemies. Recognition brought responsibilities but also distractions. The man who had thrived in solitude now found himself at the center of scientific controversies that would consume the remaining decades of his life. The next phase of Newton's career would reveal whether the same genius that had unlocked the secrets of the universe could navigate the treacherous waters of academic politics and public acclaim. The publication of the Principia should have marked the beginning of a peaceful period in Newton's life, a time to bask in the recognition of his extraordinary achievements. Instead, it unleashed a series of controversies that would consume his energy for years to come. The very success of his masterwork made Newton a target for critics who resented his revolutionary conclusions and rivals who envied his sudden fame. The quiet professor, who had preferred the solitude of his study, found himself thrust into the center of bitter disputes that revealed the darker side of 17th century scientific culture. The first major challenge came from an unexpected source: the continent. While English natural philosophers gradually accepted Newton's gravitational theory, many European scholars remained deeply skeptical. The idea that objects could attract each other across empty space without any intervening medium seemed to violate the fundamental principles of mechanical philosophy that had dominated European thought since Descartes. Critics accused Newton of reintroducing occult qualities into natural philosophy, of abandoning rational explanation in favour of mysterious forces that operated by unknown means. The opposition was led by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the brilliant German mathematician and philosopher who had independently developed his own version of calculus. Leibniz attacked Newton's concept of gravity as fundamentally unscientific, arguing that true mechanical explanation required direct contact between objects through some material medium. The idea that the sun could influence the motion of distant planets without touching them struck Leibniz as a return to the magical thinking that modern science had supposedly overcome. His critique carried enormous weight in European intellectual circles, where his reputation as a philosopher and mathematician rivaled Newton's own. Newton's response to these continental criticisms revealed the defensive streak that had characterized his reactions to opposition throughout his career. Rather than engaging constructively with his critics' concerns, he dismissed them as failures to understand the true nature of scientific explanation. Newton insisted that it was sufficient to demonstrate that gravity existed and to describe its mathematical properties. Questions about the ultimate cause or mechanism of gravitational attraction were beyond the scope of natural philosophy. This position frustrated his critics, who felt he was avoiding legitimate philosophical questions about the nature of physical causation. The dispute over gravity became entangled with an even more bitter controversy over mathematical priority. Both Newton and Leibniz had developed methods of infinitesimal calculus, but they had arrived at their discoveries independently and had expressed their results using different notations and techniques. The question of who deserved credit for this revolutionary mathematical tool became a matter of national pride, with English supporters championing Newton's method of fluxions and continental mathematicians defending Leibniz's differential calculus. What began as a scholarly disagreement gradually escalated into a vicious personal feud. Accusations of plagiarism flew in both directions, with each side claiming that the other had stolen their ideas. Anonymous pamphlets appeared attacking the character and competence of both mathematicians. Professional reputations were destroyed as scholars were forced to choose sides in a controversy that had more to do with politics and nationalism than with mathematical truth. Newton, despite his usual preference for avoiding public disputes, found himself drawn deeper and deeper into a conflict that would poison relationships between English and continental mathematicians for generations. The calculus controversy revealed Newton's capacity for vindictive behaviour when he felt his honour was at stake. He used his position as president of the Royal Society, to which he had been elected in 1703, to orchestrate attacks on Leibniz's reputation. Newton secretly authored anonymous reviews that questioned Leibniz's originality and mathematical competence. He encouraged his supporters to publish increasingly harsh criticisms of the German philosopher while maintaining a public facade of dignified restraint. The campaign was systematic and ruthless, designed to destroy Leibniz's credibility in the eyes of the international scientific community. The irony was that both men had legitimate claims to the discovery of calculus, having developed their methods independently during the same general period. Newton had discovered his fluxional calculus earlier, during the plague years of the 1660s, but he had kept it largely secret for decades. Leibniz had developed his approach later, but had published first, making his techniques available to the broader mathematical community. A fair resolution would have recognized both men as independent discoverers of fundamentally similar methods, but the poisonous atmosphere of the controversy made such compromise impossible. The mathematical dispute consumed an enormous amount of Newton's time and energy during what should have been the most productive years of his career. Instead of pursuing new research or refining his existing theories, he found himself writing polemical letters, coaching supporters, and plotting strategies to discredit his rival. The man who had unlocked the secrets of the universe was reduced to petty academic warfare, squandering his genius on battles that ultimately served no one's interests. Meanwhile, Newton's personal life was undergoing significant changes that reflected his growing status and wealth. In 1696, he accepted an appointment as Warden of the Royal Mint, a lucrative position that required him to oversee the recoinage of England's currency. The job was supposed to be largely ceremonial, but Newton characteristically threw himself into the work with the same intensity he had brought to his scientific research. He personally tracked down counterfeiters, reformed minting procedures, and established quality controls that dramatically improved the reliability of English currency. The position at the Mint marked Newton's transition from academic to public servant, from theoretical scientist to practical administrator. He moved from Cambridge to London, taking up residence in a house on St. Martin's Street that reflected his newfound prosperity and social standing. The sparse accommodations of his university rooms gave way to elegant furnishings, fine art, and an extensive library that became a gathering place for London's intellectual elite. Newton was transforming himself from a provincial professor into a metropolitan gentleman. His social circle expanded to include politicians, aristocrats, and wealthy merchants who valued his reputation as much as his conversation. Newton learned to navigate the complex world of London society, attending dinner parties, hosting salons, and cultivating relationships with powerful patrons who could advance his interests. The shy, awkward young man who had struggled to relate to his Cambridge students was becoming a polished courtier, capable of charming duchesses and impressing government ministers. Yet success in the wider world came at a cost to Newton's scientific productivity. The administrative demands of the mint, combined with his social obligations and ongoing controversies, left little time for original research. The man who had revolutionized natural philosophy during his years of solitude found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on fundamental questions when his attention was constantly diverted by practical concerns and personal disputes. The transition from scholar to public figure was professionally rewarding but intellectually limiting. Newton's changing circumstances also affected his relationships with other natural philosophers. His position as president of the Royal Society gave him enormous influence over the direction of English science, but it also made him a target for ambitious rivals who sought to challenge his authority. Younger scientists who might once have sought his mentorship now saw him as an obstacle to their own advancement. The collaborative spirit that had characterized his early work with Halley and other supporters gave way to a more hierarchical relationship between Newton and his contemporaries. The most significant of these new relationships was with Roger Cotes, a brilliant young mathematician at Cambridge, who helped prepare the second edition of the Principia for publication. Cotes possessed the mathematical sophistication to understand Newton's most advanced techniques, but he also brought fresh perspectives that helped clarify some of the more obscure passages in the original work. The collaboration between the aging master and his gifted disciple produced significant improvements to the text, making Newton's ideas more accessible to a broader audience of readers. The second edition of the Principia, published in 1713, reflected Newton's mature understanding of his own theories and his growing confidence in their universal applicability. He added new sections dealing with lunar theory, tidal calculations, and the motion of comets, demonstrating the extraordinary range of phenomena that could be explained using his gravitational principles. The mathematical presentation was also refined, with clearer proofs and more elegant demonstrations that showcased the full power of his analytical methods. But even as Newton was consolidating his scientific legacy, new challenges were emerging that would test his theories in unexpected ways. Astronomical observations were revealing small discrepancies between predicted and observed planetary motions, raising questions about the completeness of his gravitational theory. The discovery of new comets with unusual orbits suggested that the solar system might be more complex than his original calculations had assumed. Critics seized on these anomalies as evidence that Newton's system, despite its impressive successes, was not the final word on celestial mechanics. Newton responded to these challenges with characteristic thoroughness, undertaking detailed calculations to account for the newly discovered phenomena. He developed more sophisticated methods for analyzing the complex gravitational interactions between multiple bodies, recognizing that the idealized two-body problems he had solved in the original Principia were only approximations to the messy realities of the actual solar system. The work was mathematically demanding and conceptually difficult, requiring him to extend his analytical techniques in ways that pushed the boundaries of contemporary mathematics. The effort to perfect his gravitational theory consumed Newton's remaining creative energies and demonstrated both the power and limitations of his scientific method. On one hand, his ability to account for increasingly subtle astronomical effects showed that his basic insights about universal gravitation were fundamentally correct. On the other hand, the complexity of the calculations required to explain these effects revealed that complete mathematical description of natural phenomena might be far more difficult than he had originally imagined. The universe was proving to be even more intricate than the mind that had first unlocked its secrets. As Newton entered his 70s, he began to grapple with questions about his legacy and the ultimate meaning of his scientific achievements. The man who had spent his life studying the physical universe found himself increasingly drawn to theological and philosophical questions about the nature of divine providence and the relationship between scientific knowledge and religious faith. These interests were not new. Newton had been studying biblical chronology, alchemy, and theology throughout his career. But his advancing age and growing awareness of mortality gave these pursuits a new urgency and intensity. Newton's theological writings revealed a mind as systematic and rigorous in its approach to scripture as it had been in its analysis of planetary motion. He applied the same critical methods that had served him so well in natural philosophy to questions of biblical interpretation, attempting to establish accurate chronologies and to reconcile apparent contradictions in sacred texts. The results were controversial, leading him to conclusions about the nature of the Trinity and the development of Christian doctrine that placed him outside the mainstream of Anglican orthodoxy. The tensions between Newton's scientific and religious interests reflected broader questions about the relationship between reason and revelation that were central to Enlightenment thought. His gravitational theory had demonstrated the power of mathematical analysis to explain natural phenomena, but it had also raised disturbing questions about the role of divine intervention in the physical world. If the universe operated according to precise mathematical laws, what need was there for continuing divine providence? Had Newton's science eliminated God from the natural world, or had it revealed the mathematical mind behind creation? These philosophical questions would outlive Newton himself, becoming central to debates about science and religion that continued long after his death. But for Newton personally, they represented an attempt to integrate the different aspects of his intellectual life into a coherent worldview that could encompass both his scientific discoveries and his religious convictions. The man who had unified celestial and terrestrial physics was seeking to achieve a similar synthesis between natural and revealed knowledge, between the book of nature and the book of scripture. As the 1720s progressed, Newton's health began to decline noticeably. The intense intellectual labour that had characterised his entire career was taking its toll on his ageing body. He suffered from kidney stones, digestive problems, and periods of mental confusion that interfered with his ability to work. The man whose mind had once operated with supernatural clarity found himself struggling to concentrate on complex problems that would have been routine challenges in his prime. The approaching end of his extraordinary life was beginning to cast shadows over his final years. Yet even in decline, Newton remained a formidable presence in the scientific world. His authority was so great that few dared challenge his conclusions directly, and his approval could make or break the careers of younger natural philosophers. The Royal Society continued to seek his guidance on technical questions, and foreign scholars made pilgrimages to London, hoping for audiences with the legendary discoverer of universal gravitation. Newton had become not just a scientist, but a scientific institution, a living symbol of the power of human reason to comprehend the natural world. The final chapter of Newton's life was approaching, but his influence on human thought was just beginning to unfold. The mathematical methods he had developed, the physical principles he had discovered, and the philosophical questions he had raised would shape scientific inquiry for centuries to come. The shy boy from Woolsthorpe, who had learned to live alone, had given humanity tools for understanding the cosmos that would outlast empires and transform civilizations. The recognition that his time was drawing short did not diminish Newton's intellectual appetite. Despite his failing health, he continued to revise his theories, correspond with mathematicians across Europe, and pursue the theological studies that had fascinated him since his youth. His house on St. Martin's Street became a shrine of sorts, visited by pilgrims from across the continent who came to pay homage to the man who had explained the clockwork of the heavens. These visitors often found an elderly gentleman whose physical frailty belied the sharp intelligence that still burned behind his eyes. Newton's daily routine in these final years reflected a lifetime of disciplined inquiry. He rose early, spending his mornings reviewing correspondence from fellow natural philosophers who sought his opinion on various technical questions. The problems they brought him ranged from practical matters of engineering and navigation to theoretical puzzles about planetary motion and optical phenomena. Though his responses were sometimes delayed by periods of illness, they retained the mathematical precision and logical rigor that had characterized his work for 6 decades. The afternoons were often devoted to his theological investigations, a passion that had grown stronger with age. Newton's study of biblical prophecy and church history had convinced him that he was living through the final age of the world, a period when divine truth would be revealed through both natural and scriptural investigation. He spent countless hours calculating the dates of biblical events, attempting to construct a chronology that would reconcile sacred and secular history. These efforts produced manuscripts that filled dozens of volumes, works that would remain largely unpublished for centuries after his death. His approach to theology displayed the same systematic methodology that had made his physics revolutionary. Newton treated scripture as a text to be analysed with the same care he had once applied to the motion of comets. He cross-referenced different biblical passages, compared variant readings in ancient manuscripts, and attempted to establish the original meaning of prophetic texts that had been corrupted by centuries of misinterpretation. The result was a reconstruction of Christian doctrine that challenged many orthodox beliefs, particularly regarding the nature of Christ and the Trinity. These heterodox conclusions remained largely private during Newton's lifetime. He understood that public revelation of his anti-Trinitarian beliefs could destroy his reputation and possibly lead to charges of heresy. The man who had fearlessly challenged Aristotelian physics was more cautious when it came to questioning Christian orthodoxy. His theological manuscripts were carefully hidden, shared only with a few trusted correspondents who could appreciate their scholarly merit while understanding the dangers of their content. The contrast between Newton's public acclaim and his private doubts reflected the complex relationship between science and religion in early 18th century England. While his gravitational theory had been celebrated as proof of divine wisdom and design, Newton himself worried that his discoveries might be leading humanity away from proper reverence for God. The mathematical perfection of natural laws could be interpreted as evidence of a divine creator, but it could also suggest that the universe operated without need for continuing divine intervention. These philosophical tensions were never fully resolved in Newton's mind. He remained convinced that his scientific work was fundamentally compatible with religious faith, but he struggled to articulate exactly how natural knowledge and revealed truth could be reconciled. The question would outlive him, becoming central to debates about the relationship between science and religion that continue to this day. Newton's own example suggested both the possibilities and the problems inherent in attempting to serve both God and natural philosophy. As word of Newton's declining health spread through London's intellectual community, visitors began arriving with increasing frequency to pay their respects to the aging master. These pilgrimages revealed the extraordinary influence his work had achieved across Europe. French mathematicians who had once dismissed his theories now sought his blessing for their own investigations. German philosophers who had criticized his concept of gravity came to acknowledge his genius, even while maintaining their theoretical objections. Italian astronomers brought observations that confirmed his predictions with ever greater precision. The conversations that took place in Newton's study during these final years provide glimpses of a mind still grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of reality. Visitors reported that he remained deeply troubled by the philosophical implications of action at a distance, the mysterious force that allowed objects to attract each other across empty space. Though he had successfully described the mathematical properties of gravitation, he never stopped wondering about its ultimate cause and mechanism. Newton's famous declaration That he did not feign hypotheses about the cause of gravity reflected not indifference to the question, but rather a principled restraint about speculating beyond what could be mathematically demonstrated. He had learned from bitter experience that premature theorizing could lead to endless controversies that obscured rather than clarified scientific truth. Better to establish what could be proven and leave deeper questions for future generations equipped with more sophisticated tools of analysis. This methodological conservatism masked a bolder vision of scientific progress that Newton shared only with his closest associates. He believed that his work represented merely the beginning of humanity's conquest of natural knowledge, the first successful assault on mysteries that had puzzled philosophers since ancient times. Future scientists would build upon his foundations, developing more powerful mathematical techniques and discovering new physical principles that would eventually explain everything from the smallest particles of matter to the largest structures of the cosmos. The confidence underlying this vision stemmed from Newton's recognition that he had achieved something unprecedented in human history. By demonstrating that diverse natural phenomena obeyed the same mathematical laws, he had proved that the universe was fundamentally intelligible to human reason. The same mind that could count apples could also calculate the orbits of planets. The same mathematical principles that governed falling stones also determine the motion of distant comets. This unity suggested that all of nature might eventually yield its secrets to sufficiently persistent and clever investigation. Yet Newton also understood the limitations of individual genius. His own achievements had been possible only because he had built upon the work of predecessors like Galileo, Kepler, and Descartes. Future progress would require similar collaboration across generations, with each scientist contributing pieces to an ever-growing mosaic of understanding. The man who had worked in such isolation during his most creative years had come to appreciate the collective nature of scientific enterprise. This recognition led Newton to take increasing interest in the education of younger natural philosophers who might carry forward his work. Though he had never been an effective teacher, in the traditional sense, he began to see himself as responsible for ensuring that his methods and insights would survive his death. He spent considerable effort preparing definitive versions of his major works, adding explanatory notes and clearer demonstrations that would make his ideas more accessible to future readers. The third edition of the Principia, published in 1726, represented Newton's final statement about the mathematical principles underlying natural philosophy. The text incorporated decades of refinements and corrections, presenting his gravitational theory in its most polished and comprehensive form. Every major astronomical phenomenon known to 18th century science was shown to follow inevitably from the law of universal attraction, creating a monument to human reason that would inspire scientists for centuries to come. But even as Newton was putting the finishing touches on his masterwork, new discoveries were beginning to reveal the limitations of his gravitational theory. The French mathematician Alexis Clairaut had identified small discrepancies in the moon's motion that could not be explained using Newton's methods. Other astronomers were discovering comets with orbits so eccentric that they challenged conventional understanding of how gravitational forces operated at extreme distances. These anomalies suggested that the solar system might be even more complex than Newton had imagined. Rather than discouraging him, these new puzzles energized Newton's scientific imagination. He recognized that each unexplained phenomenon represented an opportunity to extend and refine his theoretical framework. The man who had spent his career solving problems that had defeated his predecessors was eager to tackle challenges that might defeat his successors as well. His final scientific papers attempted to address some of these outstanding issues, though failing health prevented him from completing the comprehensive analysis he had envisioned. The approaching end of Newton's life coincided with growing recognition of his historical significance. Educated Europeans had begun to understand that they were witnessing the conclusion of an extraordinary career that had fundamentally transformed human understanding of the natural world. The Royal Society commissioned official portraits of their most distinguished president. Publishers competed to produce collected editions of his works. Scholars began writing biographical accounts that would preserve the story of his discoveries for posterity. These early attempts at assessing Newton's legacy revealed the difficulty of comprehending the full scope of his achievements. His contributions to mathematics alone would have secured his reputation as one of history's greatest thinkers. His optical discoveries had revolutionized understanding of light and color while enabling practical advances in telescope design. His mechanical principles had solved problems in physics that had puzzled natural philosophers for centuries, and his gravitational theory had unified celestial and terrestrial phenomena in a way that seemed to reveal the mathematical mind of God himself. Yet perhaps Newton's most important legacy lay not in any specific discovery, but in the methodological approach he had pioneered. By combining mathematical analysis with careful experimental observation, he had created a new way of investigating natural phenomena that would become the foundation of modern science. His insistence on mathematical precision, his commitment to experimental verification, and his willingness to abandon cherished theories when they conflicted with empirical evidence established standards that would guide scientific inquiry for generations. The influence of Newton's methodology extended far beyond natural philosophy. Economists began applying mathematical techniques to analyze market behavior. Political theorists sought to discover the laws governing human societies. Even theologians attempted to use Newtonian principles to understand divine providence and human salvation. The conviction that rigorous analysis could unlock the secrets of any domain of experience became one of the defining characteristics of Enlightenment thought. This broader cultural impact reflected Newton's success in demonstrating that human reason possessed almost unlimited power to comprehend reality. The same intellectual faculties that enabled ordinary people to navigate daily life could also, when properly disciplined and directed, penetrate the deepest mysteries of existence. The universe was not an arbitrary collection of unrelated phenomena, but a rational system operating according to discoverable laws that human minds could grasp and express in mathematical form. As Newton's 80th birthday approached in late 1722, his physical condition had deteriorated to the point where even his most devoted admirers recognized that the end was near. The kidney stones that had plagued him for years were causing increasing pain and difficulty. His digestion was failing, making it difficult for him to maintain the nutrition necessary for his weakened body. Most troubling of all, his legendary mental powers were beginning to show signs of decline, with periods of confusion and memory loss that interfered with his ability to work. Despite these mounting infirmities, Newton continued to receive visitors and correspond with fellow natural philosophers until almost the very end. His passion for understanding remained undiminished, even as his capacity for sustained intellectual effort diminished. Colleagues who had known him for decades were amazed by his continued interest in new discoveries and his eagerness to discuss theoretical problems that might occupy future generations of scientists. The final months of Newton's life were marked by a growing sense of urgency about preserving his unpublished manuscripts and ensuring that his theological investigations would not be lost. He spent considerable effort organizing his papers and preparing instructions for their eventual disposition. The man who had kept so many secrets during his lifetime was finally ready to entrust his most private thoughts to posterity. Though he insisted that his religious writings should remain sealed until long after his death, his greatest concern was that his scientific legacy might be misunderstood or misrepresented by those who lacked the mathematical sophistication to appreciate his methods. Newton had devoted his life to discovering truth through rigorous analysis, and he feared that his discoveries might be corrupted by followers who preferred easy answers to difficult questions. The precision and rigour that had made his work revolutionary could also make it vulnerable to simplification and distortion by less careful minds. These worries proved prescient. Even before Newton's death, popularizers were beginning to present simplified versions of his theories that captured their practical utility while sacrificing their mathematical elegance. The complex philosophical questions that had troubled Newton himself were often ignored in favour of straightforward applications that could be easily understood and quickly implemented. The man who had spent decades refining his ideas was already watching them transform into something both more accessible and less profound than he had intended. Yet Newton also recognised that this process of simplification and popularisation was inevitable and perhaps necessary. Scientific progress required that new discoveries be communicated to broader audiences who could find practical applications for theoretical insights. The mathematical tools he had developed would be most valuable if they could be used by engineers, navigators, and other practitioners who needed reliable methods for solving real-world problems. The tension between precision and accessibility was inherent in the scientific enterprise itself. As the winter of 1726 gave way to spring, Newton's condition continued to deteriorate. The man who had once worked 18 hours a day without fatigue now found it difficult to concentrate for more than a few minutes at a time. His handwriting, once precise and elegant, became shaky and barely legible. The physical decline was painful for friends to witness, but Newton himself seemed to accept it with the same philosophical detachment he had brought to his scientific investigations. In his final conversations, Newton reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from a premature infant in a Lincolnshire farmhouse to the most celebrated natural philosopher in Europe. He spoke of his early fascination with mechanical devices, his transformative years at Cambridge, and the plague-induced isolation that had enabled his greatest discoveries. The narrative of his life seemed to him like a single, coherent story about the power of human curiosity and persistence to unlock the secrets of creation. The approaching end held no terror for Newton. His theological studies had convinced him that death was merely a transition to a higher state of existence, where the limitations of mortal understanding would be transcended. The man who had spent his life studying the mathematical laws governing the physical universe looked forward to discovering whatever principles might govern spiritual reality. His faith in the ultimate rationality of existence remained unshaken by the prospect of his own mortality. On March 20th, 1727, Isaac Newton died peacefully in his home on St. Martin Street, surrounded by friends and colleagues who had gathered to pay their final respects. He was 84 years old, an extraordinary age for someone born in the 17th century. His death marked the end of an era in the history of human thought, the conclusion of a life that had bridged the gap between ancient philosophy and modern science. The boy who had been too small to survive had lived long enough to change how humanity understood its place in the cosmos. The funeral of Isaac Newton became a spectacle unlike anything England had witnessed for a man of science. Westminster Abbey, the sacred resting place of kings and queens, opened its doors to receive the body of a mathematician and natural philosopher. The decision sparked controversy among traditionalists who questioned whether a scholar, however brilliant, deserved such extraordinary honour. But Newton's supporters understood that they were burying more than a man. They were laying to rest the mind that had fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of reality itself. The procession through London streets drew crowds of unprecedented size. Nobles and commoners alike lined the route, eager to witness the final journey of the man who had explained the motion of planets and unlocked the secrets of light. The Lord Chancellor served as chief pallbearer, accompanied by dukes and earls who had competed for the privilege of honouring Newton's memory. The Royal Society marched in formation, their ceremonial robes a testament to the institutional power that natural philosophy had achieved under Newton's leadership. Inside Westminster Abbey, the greatest minds of the age gathered to pay tribute to their departed colleague. Edmund Halley, now an elderly man himself, wept openly as he recalled the young professor who had casually mentioned that planets moved in ellipses. Roger Coates delivered a eulogy that attempted to capture the magnitude of Newton's intellectual achievements, though he acknowledged that no words could adequately express what had been lost. The ceremony was both a celebration of extraordinary accomplishment and a recognition that an irreplaceable voice had been silenced forever. The tomb, erected for Newton, reflected the reverence in which he was held by his contemporaries. Elaborate sculptures depicted scenes from his discoveries, with allegorical figures representing mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, mourning the loss of their greatest champion. The Latin inscription proclaimed that mortals should rejoice that such a man had lived among them, a sentiment that captured the almost religious awe that Newton's work had inspired. Here lay not just a scientist, but a prophet of reason who had revealed divine truth through mathematical analysis. Yet even as Newton's body was laid to rest, his ideas were beginning a new phase of their existence. The Principia, which had been read by only a handful of mathematicians during Newton's lifetime, started to reach broader audiences through translations and popular expositions. French encyclopedists seized upon Newtonian mechanics as proof that human reason could comprehend all aspects of reality. German philosophers incorporated his insights into systematic accounts of knowledge and existence. Italian scientists used his methods to solve practical problems in engineering and navigation. The transformation of Newton's legacy began almost immediately after his death. Voltaire, who had witnessed Newton's funeral during his exile in England, returned to France as an evangelist for the dead philosopher's revolutionary approach to natural investigation. His popular writings portrayed Newton as the greatest genius in human history, a man whose discoveries had definitively proved the superiority of empirical science over traditional authority. The complex, secretive individual who had struggled with theological doubts was reimagined as a heroic figure of Enlightenment rationality. This process of mythologization served important cultural purposes, but also distorted understanding of Newton's actual methods and motivations. The man who had spent decades studying alchemy and biblical prophecy was presented as a pure rationalist who relied solely on mathematical analysis and experimental observation. His theological investigations, which had occupied as much of his time as his scientific work, were either ignored or dismissed as unfortunate aberrations that detracted from his real achievements. The Newton of popular imagination bore only partial resemblance to the complicated historical figure. The selective interpretation of Newton's legacy reflected broader tensions within Enlightenment thought about the relationship between reason and faith. Progressive thinkers wanted to claim Newton as proof that science could replace religion as humanity's guide to truth. Conservative voices insisted that his discoveries actually demonstrated the wisdom and power of divine creation. Both sides found evidence to support their positions in Newton's writings, though neither acknowledged the profound ambiguity that had characterized his own understanding of these questions. Meanwhile, Newton's mathematical and physical insights were being developed by a new generation of natural philosophers who possessed neither his genius nor his philosophical reservations. Leonhard Euler extended Newton's mechanics to solve increasingly complex problems in astronomy and engineering. Joseph Louis Lagrange reformulated Newtonian principles using analytical techniques that were more powerful than the geometric methods Newton had preferred. Pierre-Simon Laplace applied probabilistic analysis to celestial mechanics, creating a comprehensive system that could predict astronomical phenomena with unprecedented precision. These developments represented both the fulfillment and the transcendence of Newton's vision. His dream of reducing natural philosophy to mathematical form was being realized more completely than he had imagined possible. Yet the new mathematics was so sophisticated that it moved far beyond anything Newton himself had conceived. The students had surpassed their master, using tools he had created to explore territories he had never entered. The revolution he had begun was continuing without him. The practical applications of Newtonian science began to transform daily life in ways that validated his confidence in the power of mathematical analysis. Navigation became more accurate as astronomers used his gravitational theory to predict the positions of celestial bodies with extraordinary precision. Engineers applied his mechanical principles to design more efficient machines and stronger buildings. Military experts used his ballistics calculations to improve artillery accuracy. The abstract mathematics that Newton had developed in solitude was proving its worth in countless practical applications. These technological advances had profound social and economic consequences. Improved navigation enabled the expansion of global trade that would fuel industrial development. Better engineering made possible the construction of canals, bridges, and factories that transformed the landscape of Europe. More accurate timekeeping, based on Newton's analysis of pendulum motion, coordinated increasingly complex economic activities. The mathematical understanding of nature that Newton had pioneered was becoming the foundation of a new kind of civilization. Yet this practical success also created new problems that Newton had not anticipated. The mechanical worldview that emerged from his physics suggested that human behavior might be as predictable and controllable as planetary motion. Social theorists began applying Newtonian methods to analyze political systems, economic markets, and cultural institutions. The result was a growing conviction that rational analysis could solve all human problems, a confidence that would have both liberating and oppressive consequences for future generations. The influence of Newtonian thinking extended into domains far removed from natural philosophy. Legal scholars attempted to discover universal principles of justice that could be applied across different societies and cultures. Political economists sought mathematical laws governing the production and distribution of wealth. Even artists and writers began to think of their work in terms of underlying rules and systematic methods that could be studied and perfected through rational investigation. This expansion of scientific methodology reflected the enormous prestige that Newton's achievements had brought to mathematical analysis and experimental investigation. If such methods could unlock the secrets of planetary motion and optical phenomena, why could they not also explain human psychology, social organization, and cultural development? The success of Newtonian physics seemed to justify unlimited confidence in the power of human reason to comprehend all aspects of reality. Yet the application of scientific methods to human affairs also revealed their limitations in ways that Newton himself had dimly perceived. The complexity of social systems proved far greater than even the most sophisticated celestial mechanics. Human behavior was influenced by factors that resisted mathematical analysis and experimental control. The precision that characterized Newton's physics could not be achieved in domains where consciousness, emotion, and cultural tradition played determining roles. These difficulties did not immediately dampen enthusiasm for the Newtonian program of reducing all knowledge to mathematical form. The spectacular success of his gravitational theory created such confidence in scientific methodology that temporary failures in other domains were attributed to inadequate techniques rather than fundamental limitations. Each generation of scholars expected that improved methods would eventually bring human affairs under the same kind of rational control that Newton had achieved over natural phenomena. The persistence of this faith testified to the extraordinary impact of Newton's example on European intellectual culture. He had demonstrated that sustained rational investigation could penetrate mysteries that had puzzled humanity since ancient times. The same mind that had once cowered before comets and eclipses could now predict their occurrence with mathematical precision. The universe that had seemed chaotic and unpredictable was revealed to be an orderly system operating according to discoverable laws. This transformation in humanity's relationship to nature represented perhaps Newton's most profound legacy. He had shown that the physical world was not an alien realm governed by incomprehensible forces, but rather a rational system that human intelligence could understand and manipulate. The confidence that emerged from this recognition would drive scientific investigation for centuries, inspiring countless researchers to tackle problems that previous generations had considered impossible to solve. Yet Newton's own example also suggested the personal costs that such dedication to rational investigation could exact. His extraordinary achievements had required decades of isolation, obsessive concentration, and willingness to sacrifice normal human relationships for the pursuit of truth. The man who had unlocked the secrets of the universe had remained largely a mystery to those who knew him best. His legacy raised troubling questions about whether intellectual greatness necessarily required emotional isolation. The Newton, who emerged from historical accounts written in the decades after his death, was a figure both inspiring and cautionary. His discoveries had proved the power of human reason to comprehend natural phenomena, but his life had also demonstrated the psychological difficulties that could accompany such intense intellectual focus. Future generations would struggle to understand how someone could be simultaneously so successful in understanding nature and so unsuccessful in understanding himself. These biographical puzzles reflected deeper philosophical questions about the relationship between scientific knowledge and human wisdom. Newton had achieved unprecedented insight into the mathematical structure of physical reality, but he had remained troubled by questions about the ultimate meaning and purpose of existence. His gravitational theory could predict the motion of planets with extraordinary accuracy, but it could not explain why the universe existed at all, or what significance human life might have within its vast mechanical operations. The tension between scientific explanation and existential meaning would become one of the central problems of modern thought, a legacy of the intellectual revolution that Newton had initiated. His success in reducing natural phenomena to mathematical laws had created expectations that similar methods might eventually explain everything, including consciousness, morality, and spiritual experience. Yet his own life suggested that such complete reduction might be impossible, or perhaps even undesirable. As the 18th century progressed and Newton's influence continued to expand, these philosophical challenges became increasingly apparent to thoughtful observers. The mechanical universe that emerged from his physics was magnificent in its mathematical elegance, but seemed to leave no room for human freedom, moral responsibility, or spiritual significance. Critics began to argue that Newtonian science, whatever its practical benefits, was fundamentally dehumanizing in its implications. The infant who was expected to die before his first birthday lived to become immortal. Isaac Newton transformed from a premature child who could fit in a quart pot into the mind that unlocked the mathematical language of creation itself. From his abandoned childhood in Woolsthorpe to his final days as the most celebrated philosopher in Europe, Newton's journey reveals the extraordinary power of human curiosity and relentless questioning. His legacy lives on not just in the equations that bear his name, but in every moment we dare to ask why the universe works as it does, proving that the greatest discoveries come to those who refuse to accept that anything is beyond understanding.